This is Mark Guerrero. Welcome to East L.A. Music Stories. The guest today is me. I've been thinking about this. Who would I get to interview me? And it happened just by the universe again. Uh, Pedro Arroyo, thank you very much. He contacted me to do an interview for his radio show. And I just thought, hell, let's do a 2-for-1. We'll do it, make it into an East LA Music Stories as well. So thank you, Pedro.
Let's do this, Mark.
All right.
Today is May 3rd, 2024, and I'm speaking with Mark Guerrero, musician, songwriter, producer, and I would say a Chicano music scholar. Welcome to KPFA, Mark. How are you this afternoon?
I'm doing great, man. Feeling good.
Great, great. So, Mark, I guess to begin, to say that you grew up in a music family is an understatement. You are the
True.
son of Lalo Guerrero, the father of Chicano music, and then someone who's who's given the world of music so much. But I'm curious to know, what are some of those early musical memories for you? So that's one question. And then, did you pick up the instrument simply because you saw your dad, and in the case of your father, he did play the guitar, or was there another route for you?
Well, it's a two-part question, it sounds like.
Yes.
The first part was the music around me. Well, obviously, since my dad was a singer-songwriter musician, from the time I was a little kid, he was writing songs, he was, performing, and I'd see him perform once in a while. And so, his music was all around and musicians were all around. But the way I got into music was in the third grade, they gave us an opportunity to pick an instrument and be in a school orchestra. They don't have that anymore, from what I hear. But in the third grade, I don't know why, but I selected clarinet. So I played clarinet in the school orchestra, third grade through ninth grade, elementary school to junior high. So that was my musical life at that point. I didn't get a guitar until I was about 12. And it wasn't because of my dad. It was because it seemed like so many friends of mine and people in my neighborhood had guitars, and they'd sit on their porch and they do La Bamba and honky tonk, and people had guitars and they just wanted to have one. So I asked my dad if he could buy me one. And a lot of my friends, their guitars are from Tijuana. They were these cheap little kind of requinto type guitars. And I just asked my dad, next time I go to TJ, can you get me a guitar? So that happened. We went down there, and I remember it cost $8, So I got my first guitar, and I started playing, rock and roll mainly, and La Bamba. That was about the only thing in Spanish. And my dad didn't really teach me guitar per se. I just remember that he taught me a few chords. And my big memory was when the Beatles came out. I was a huge Beatles fan right from the get-go. And I was trying to learn I Want to Hold Your Hand. And that song had more complex chords than usual rock and roll, And I was having a little problem. So my dad helped me figure out I Want to Hold Your Hand. And I remember that very distinctly. But other than that, I just went off on my own. And at that point, I was way more influenced by rock and roll than Latino music, or even I was aware of my dad's music and I loved it, but I wasn't going that direction.
Yeah. There was something that I heard you say that kind of that I wanted to follow up on. So, from what I understand, your father didn't have any formal training as a musician, but then he was able to figure out kind of like the chord structures of that particular Beatles song.
Yes, yeah, oh yeah, because he had a great ear, and it's the same thing with me. We're as they call us head musicians, not from reading and not from book learning. But yeah, my dad was a complete natural, never had a lesson in his life, never studied music theory whatsoever, couldn't read or write music in a formal sense. But his talent didn't come from nowhere. It came from my grandmother. His mother played guitar beautifully and sang beautifully, but she didn't have a career because in 1910, a Mexican woman with, 8, 10 kids or 12 kids, whatever it was, was just a homemaker. But she had talent, and she taught my dad his first guitar chords and his first songs. So that's where that came from. And me, despite my 6 years of clarinet playing and reading music, that's the only formal education I ever had. I never took lessons. I think I only had 4 guitar lessons sometime in the mid 70s, just to learn some more interesting chords and things like that. Um, but that was as far as guitar, 4 lessons and what my dad showed me in the beginning, and just from listening to records. I had a little formal training a little later in the 80s. I took some classes at Dick Grove School of Music about harmony and ear training, that kind of thing, and that helped as well. But mostly it's natural, and it's just, without formal training.
Yeah, you're what we would call an autodidact, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
like a lot of musicians, yeah.
Yes, yes. You did mention that part of a kind of what influenced you or drew you to the guitar was that other kids in the neighborhood were playing. So kind of set the stage. Where is that neighborhood? And kind of paint a picture of where that location is, and then how that kind of that space influenced kind of your music making.
What a great question. God, I mean, I lived on McDonald Avenue in East Los Angeles, kind of between Whittier Boulevard and 3rd Street. And just a lot of people had guitars in my neighborhood, and there were little bands starting to start up, and um, that's the way it was. And you got to remember, this was in the early days of rock and roll, because if you think about it, rock and roll as we know it, you know, mid 50s kind of, of course it had black roots before that, but mid 50s is when Elvis and Rock Around the Clock and all this stuff started coming out, Bill Haley and the Comets. So, we're talking 1962, 63, we're talking about when I started picking up guitar, 62. So rock and roll, as we know, was only 7 years old. Nowadays, kids that want to get into rock and roll, they've got like 70 years of history to look at. It was new, and having electric guitars and bands was really kind of new. And it just so happened that in East L.A. around that period, tons of people started buying electric guitars and forming bands, and that gave birth to the whole East Side sound of the 60s, what I call the golden era, that early era.
Yeah. Can you share a little bit about the kind of the formation of Mark and the Escorts? So again, I believe you were 16, Mark?
No, 13.
You were 13. Okay.
Yes.
Okay, even younger. Okay.
Even younger. And again, you know what? I found out in life, as you get older, you realize almost everything that happens to you is almost just the universe. It's like it just happens, and all the best things that have happened to me just happened. And this is an example. So when I was in that 3rd grade orchestra, the drummer was Ernie Hernandez, who happened to live 3 or 4 doors up from me on McDonald Avenue. And I kind of met Ernie around that time. And also in the band, on trumpet, was Rick Rosas, who later became my bass player. And Ernie and Rick wound up playing with me from 63 to 74, 75. So it just was one of those things that what later became Tango, my A&M group in 1973. 2 of the guys were in my grammar school orchestra. That's the way the universe works. It's crazy. So anyway, so Ernie had a full drum set when he was 12, 13 years old. And he met this guitar player named Robert Warren, an African-American kid. And so one day, Ernie comes over to my house and he says, hey, man, by then I had an electric guitar and an amp, a little Gibson 1 pickup guitar my dad had gotten me about a year after that acoustic one I told you about. And he said, hey, bring your guitar and amp over, man. I got a friend here, and let's play. And I remember I was playing with my friends, I might have been whatever we were doing. And I didn't want to go. I go, geez, okay. And I kind of reluctantly got my stuff and went over there. So we just started playing. Next thing you knew, a couple of weeks later, we were playing at a house party at Ernie's cousin's house. And then we got a gig somewhere and suddenly we were a band. It just happened. We called ourselves the Escorts. And then we started adding people. It started out with just me, Robert, and Ernie, two guitars and drums. And in those days, a lot of people, a lot of kids in East LA didn't have bass guitars. That was a real odd thing. There were electric guitars, but very few little kids had basses. So there were bands that didn't have a bass. I mean, the Beatles, I've read, where when they started, they didn't have a bass player. They were just three guitars and drums on their early gigs. And that's what we did. So at one point, I asked Rick Rosas, who was a good friend of mine, who played trumpet, like I said before. I said, hey, get a bass and an amp and you can get in our band. It was that simple. Huh? And so I knew his parents had some resources for that. And so he got it, showed up. He started showing them how to play. Next thing you know, we're a four-piece. Then we added a lead singer because I wasn't singing in those days. And then we added a sax player. Then we added a baritone sax player. Then we had a keyboard player. So we got up to seven-piece. And it was that group that recorded our first records on GMP Crescendo Records in 1965, which was the A side of one was Get Your Baby, which has a tremendous history. It's an instrumental. I played lead guitar on it. And it's been on many, many compilation albums over the years. And it was even in a major movie in 2017 called Logan Lucky with Channing Tatum and Adam Driver and Katie Holmes. And so that record, the first thing I ever did, has had a tremendous life of its own. Then we made a second single. A-side was Dance With Me. And that has been on a compilation or two. But that's kind of how the band evolved. And then somewhere along the line, it became Mark and the Escorts. And it wasn't my idea. It was not my idea. Our sax player was taking a printing class in high school, and he printed up some band cards for us. And it said, Music for All Occasions, Mark and the Escorts. And he just did that. And I think he did it because at the time, there were a lot of bands with that kind of a name. Ronnie and the Casuals, Bobby and the Esquires, Art and the Nightlighters. It was the thing. So it became Mark and the Escorts by accident, and so that's who we were.
Yeah. I mean, I'm curious just to kind of get your perspective as, kind of as your band, or as this band was recording, playing, there were also kind of other bands that were forming, recording. Like what are some of the factors that you think kind of drove that? And like I really like how you framed the response to this first question, which was rock and roll as we know it was new. And so like I'm wondering if that newness and that energy of rock and roll also kind of launched or influenced or encouraged other young musicians. But I want to get, because you were there and you saw what was going on around you in East Los Angeles. What are some of the factors that you think contributed to kind of just this creative kind of burst of music being created?
It was really exciting. It was super exciting because, we were all into music. And think about what the musical landscape was at that time. In the early 60s, you had all the doo-wop stuff, Duke of Earl and all those kind of records that we loved. And then you had the rock and roll, had all the Elvis and all that had happened, and the Everly Brothers and Jerry Lee Lewis and Little Richard, Chuck Berry, all that was going on. In fact, a lot of the East LA bands at the very beginning started with surf music because in 62, 63, that was really happening, Wipeout, The Ventures, songs like Pipeline, and Dick Dale was huge. So everybody was learning those songs, and there were a lot of surf bands in East LA, and many of us started that way. That was an exciting thing that was going on right then. So we had all those things to draw on and all the great R&B tunes. So everybody was very excited about music. And then the British invasion hit, and man, another major explosion happened, and that influenced most of the East LA groups as well. And so we were very inspired. And that musical boom that happened, it's just one of those things in the world, like what I was saying with me, they just happened. Nobody planned it. Nobody sat down and said, let's create a music scene in East LA and we'll open up a bunch of teenage nightclubs and teenage venues. And no, it just happened. Before you knew it, there's all these bands in every garages all over town and all these venues. like San Alfonso's Auditorium, the Kennedy Hall, the Montebello Ballroom, the Big Union, the Little Union, and all these, VFWs and Serbian Hall and Croatian Hall. There were all these places where there would be teenage dances and teenage bands. You don't see that anymore, and you hardly saw it since. So it just was a magical big bang that just spontaneously happened, and we were just all part of it. And oh, this is great, and we just were in it. And as we all look back on it, because as you know, I interview musicians all the time on this era and the East LA scene. We all feel that was like it just happened, and we were part of it. We didn't question it, and when we look back on it, we go, "Man, were we lucky? That was just incredible to be a part of that."
Yeah. Mark, is there a memorable performance with memorable bands that from that particular time, specifically when you were playing with the Escorts or Mark and the Escorts?
I have a few. One would be the West Coast East Side show at the Shrine Auditorium in 1965. And it had about 15 East LA bands on the bill. The Midnighters, the Blue Satins, and, the Blendells and Cannibal and the Headhunters, and Mark and the Escorts, and the Salas Brothers, who later became Tierra, Salas Brothers, who were with the Jaguars at that time. It was just this huge event sponsored by KRLA Radio, and the Hullabalooer, Dave Hull, was the host. It was a big deal. It was a big deal for a lot of East LA fans to go to the West Side, to go over by USC to the Shrine Auditorium. But it was a historic event. And a little after that, an album came out with the same name, West Coast East Side Review. But it had records from most of those bands, studio recordings. And that's still around. If you're lucky, you can find it on eBay or something for a lot of money. But so that was very exciting. But there were other shows that I remember, like there was one show where Mark and the Escorts were on the bill with the Blendells and the Premiers, the three groups. And the Blendells and Premiers at the time both had national hit records. So it was very exciting to be on the bill with the two kind of most popular bands at that moment. And we had our record out too. So that's a good memory. And playing with groups like that. And we love the Blendells. And so it was fun doing that. There were other shows where we would be on the bill with a lot of R&B groups and more mainstream kind of groups. One time, my second group, Mark and the Escorts, evolved into the Men from Sound in 1966. It was me, Rick Rosas, and Ernie, the core, and by then we had different members. The Men from Sound, we got very popular as well, and we were on the bill with Dobie Gray, who had the hit "In Crowd." I'm in with the In Crowd, and later "Drift Away." Give me the beat, boys, and free my soul. Dobie Gray, and we got to back him up. These little 15-year-old kids, and he came to our rehearsal, and we were blown away that we could play with him. But those are a few that just come to mind. But so many exciting shows, and oftentimes there'd be 5, 6, 7, 8 bands on the bill. Crazy.
Wow. Can you speak a little bit about how you negotiated kind of your interactions with promoters, record labels, given that you were just a teenager?
Yeah, the first gigs were just word of mouth, and our drummer's dad, Ernie Hernandez Sr., was just great to us. He would drive us to the gigs in his truck and take our equipment and take pictures of everything. That's why we're so documented. He took pictures just of everywhere we played. But he got us a couple of gigs. I remember doing one in Claremont that he got, and 2 of them actually. And played at the CYO Hall. We played at Laguna Park, which is now Ruben Salazar Park. And then we started playing a lot of these shows with the major groups of East LA at the time. But it really took a boost when we got picked up by Billy Cardenas. Billy Cardenas was a manager, and he was managing the Blendells, the Premiers. He was working with Cannibal and the Headhunters. He had the Sisters, Ronnie and the Casuals, the Pageants, the Atlantics. He had all kinds of groups, and he was booking groups and getting a lot of them into the studio. And that's how we got into the studio. And he started getting us gigs. at San Alfonso and some of these places. And then once we got popular, all the other promoters started calling me. So I was the go-between. You know, there was a guy, Paul Carlin, who booked the Big Union, an ex-boxer who had to chase around to get paid. Um, you know, Sam Nevada at the Little Union. Different promoters started calling me up, and it came through me, most of those gigs after that.
And what about kind of on the recording side? How did you
Well,
when you were when you were dealing with labels and
Well, that was Billy Cardenas, because again, he had all kinds of connections by then because he had a lot of groups recording. But at this point, I must talk about Eddie Davis. So Eddie Davis, he had 8 small independent record companies: Faro, Rampart, Linda, Gordo, all these labels. And he and Billy teamed up, and they became a great team because Billy would go out and find these bands and groom the bands, and then take them into the studio with Eddie and due to Eddie's labels. That's how the Blendells got to record, and the Premiers and Cannibal Headhunters and us. And all those groups I mentioned, well, not all of them, most of them were through Billy and Eddie Davis. No, that's how it happened for me and for many of us. But there was another person around, and that was Bob Keane. Bob Keane is the one that discovered Richie Valens and put out his records. And Bob Keane had a label called Delphi.
yeah.
And he had a couple of subsidiaries also, Mustang and Donna. And a lot of the East LA artists recorded for him. Little Ray Jimenez, the Sisters, Ronnie and the Casuals. So again, we were lucky. Not only did this music boom happen in East LA, but all these record companies were in place to help us get record deals. And that was thanks to Bob Keane and Eddie Davis and Billy Cardenas. And then later on, Eddie Torres, the manager of the Midnighters, started his own label, Whittier Records. So we had all these opportunities, you know, and we were only living 20 minutes from Hollywood, where all the studios were. So it was all an incredible, magical thing that happened.
Gotcha. From the time of Mark and the Escorts, is there a track that kind of really embodies kind of the sound of the band? And if you can introduce it,
Oh yeah,
yeah.
I'd like to talk about the evolution of the styles. Okay.
Yeah.
So we started out with surf stuff, you know, all instrumentals. And we do maybe a blues, but it was all instrumentals at first. Then we started doing vocal stuff, and we do the doo-wop stuff. We do R&B. We would do, you know, Stax Volt when Motown came out. And then the British Invasion, then we started doing the Beatles and the Stones and the Kinks and the Animals. So we evolved with the times and with the greater music scene worldwide, you know, and all these East bands. That's what we did. We went by what we heard on the radio. And James Brown came out, and everybody's playing that. And then as the 60s went on, and then the psychedelic era came in, and you had Cream and Jimi Hendrix, and you know, the Beatles by then were doing Sgt. Pepper. And so we all evolved along with it, you know. And that's kind of what we did. We embodied all those different styles.
Gotcha. As the you know the 1960s kind of start to come to an end, and you know the Chicano movement really begins to take hold in California and in East LA in particular. Like how did kind of that movement, things that were happening in the neighborhood, not only kind of like the musical explosion, but the arts, theater, how did like those changes begin to kind of influence, shape kind of the sound that you would begin to make in the 1970s? And in particular, did that influence your writing and recording of Brown?
Right. Well, there are a lot of outside influences that, you know, like social issues, things beyond, like, for example, the Vietnam War. We all got caught up in possibly getting drafted, and the Chicano movement started by the late 60s. And that's when a lot of the bands started changing their names to, you know, Maya or El Chicano or Los whatevers, and where we started writing, incorporating more Latin rhythms, more maybe bilingual stuff. We started getting more Chicano, as it evolved. So all those outside influences influenced the music. So, late 60s, El Chicano, well, maybe 1970, they did a record called Don't Put Me Down If I'm Brown. The Midnighters did Chicano Power. And in my case, in 1971, I believe, I wrote I'm Brown, which I'm really proud of that song and is the record that we made of it. We recorded it in 1972, and I was just inspired. I was just feeling super, super Chicano. So it's kind of a protest song, but at the same time, I'm proud of the message. The message of the chorus and the song is, don't you know I'm brown? Can't you see my face? But I'm first a member of the human race. And I love that because at that time, at the beginning of the Black movement, the Chicano movement, it was very, I'm Chicano, and almost a little bit anti-white, you know what I mean? Because a lot of the resentment for what happened to us, the oppression and everything else. But when it comes down to it, we all are human, and that's a great message, and we are first humans. And even Malcolm X found that out. Malcolm X was get whitey, the white devil, all that stuff during his radical period. Then he went to Mecca, and he saw whites there and everybody worshiping together. And he said, oh my God, I was wrong about that, so he mellowed on that issue. But that's what it all comes down to. We're so divided. But if we could all just realize we're all human, that would be the first step in gaining some sanity in what's going on in the world, But the fact that I wrote that at 21 years old, I feel pretty good about. And the record, it was magic. It just, we went into independent studios. At the time, I was working with Art Brambilla, who was our manager, who also managed the original Tierra and Yaqui, and was instrumental in helping them and others get major record deals at the time. Well, we went in there, and I had Ernie Hernandez on drums, my first drummer, Rick Rosas on bass. I played acoustic guitar on the basic track. Then I overdubbed a piano. I overdubbed a piano with a solo, and then I played one of the two lead guitars on it. The other lead guitar player was John Valenzuela, and my friend Anthony Beret from the group The Emeralds played Hammond organ on it. And that thing jumped on tape. We did it live, one take. I did my piano part, one take. We did the two lead guitar parts, one take. I did my vocal, one or two takes. And it's the record I'm most proud of to this day, and the song I'm most proud of to this day. And it needs to get out there more, because since Capitol Records, who put it out as a single, did not promote it, it never got any promotion. And on top of that, it was 4 minutes and 45 seconds in a time when records were supposed to be 2 minutes and 30 seconds so they can get all the commercials in. You tried not to go over 2 minutes and 30 seconds. Well, I just said, well, this song is this long, and I want it this long. And I did it for all those reasons. And maybe there was some racism at the company, maybe there was some racism at the radio stations, but it didn't get much airplay. But it's been in the Grammy Museum twice in an exhibit called Songs of Conscience, Sounds of Freedom, first time in 2007 and later in 2022. And I got to perform it at the Grammy Museum that year. Willie G was on that show, and Jerry Gonzalez, and you can see it on YouTube. But I'm Brown is being discovered more and more. It's been mentioned in books, and but that's one of my goals in life, besides all the history I'm documenting, is to get that song out so that the Latino community can hear it, the youth, but also everybody. I mean, that song, I believe, needs to be out there. And so anything you can do, get it out there. If you go to YouTube, you'll see me performing it live with various groups all over the place. If you would Mark Guerrero, I'm Brown, you'll find tons of live versions of it, plus a studio version. Plus I did a studio version of it in 2017 with me lip syncing to my original record, video by Jammin' Classics, my friend Tony Reyes. So Look it up and
Yeah.
pass the word.
You know, on that particular track, like what are some of like the influences that you were pulling on?
Okay.
So can you speak to that? Because, you know, like I remember hearing the piece when you first shared it with me, probably over a decade ago, and then I listened to it again just a number of years ago, and then I heard it on a 7-inch vinyl, and it really felt different. And I think maybe there's a way in which one like can listen to a piece um passively, or then there's also ways in which like you don't really kind of begin to understand kind of the meaning or the message of a piece of music until you're at a certain age or at a certain place. And I think when I sat down and really like listened with intentionality just a couple of weeks ago, it like it really blew me away. And it blew me away in the sense of like how it fit into maybe what was happening with other styles of music in the 1970s, but how it also kind of diverged a little bit from what, you know, what Tierra Malo and Yaqui and some of those bands were
Yeah, I
doing.
was different from all those groups because
It was. So
all
can you
those
speak to
groups,
that?
yeah, all those groups were mainly influenced by uh, Latin Latin jazz, R&B. That was their thing, and doo-wop. I had those things in me, but I was more enamored with the Beatles and Bob Dylan and the Buffalo Springfield. And I was totally immersed in that. And that was probably my greatest influence. So the influences of all those people are on that record as well. Um, but I did want to mention one verse. I want to just say one verse because to put it next to the idea of we're all part of the human race, that's the real positive message. But the verses are very protest. They're very tough. It says, "You're brown, you can hang around just as long as you don't make a sound. Don't call us, we'll keep in touch just as long as you don't say too much. So take a step to the back of your heart. It isn't much, but you know it's a start. Don't you know I'm brown? Can't you see my face? But I'm first a member of the human race." So it's the lyrics are very protest and tough, but then I say, hey, but I'm proud I'm Chicano and I'm fighting on this cause, but let's not forget we're all human. But yeah, there are influences in that. There's a bit of Beatle influence, Dylan influence, Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young influence. Um, that's all in there. Yeah. But as I went on, uh, in the late 70s, my music got even more Chicano because after I was with A&M Records, 73 and 74, who also released I'm Brown on an album cut of our first album, of our only album, Tango. I went back to school. I got fed up with the music business because I had been on 4 major labels in 5 years. And Cap Records, which was MCA, Ode Records, distributed by A&M, produced by Lou Adler, who produced Carole King and the Mamas and the Papas. I was signed to Lou Adler when Carole King had just completed Tapestry and it was going up the charts. And so those 4 labels, Cap, Ode, Capital, and A&M were in 5 years. And I believe I made a lot of great records and a lot of songs that could have been hits, but I never got any real promotion. Never got to do a tour, a real tour. Never, saw ads in Billboard magazine or billboards. I mean, virtually no promotion. I don't know if it was because of prejudice. I'm sure part of it. Part of it might have been record companies at that time, and probably even now, feel that Chicano groups, Latino groups, are only going to sell in the Southwest. Who cares about that in Alabama or in New Hampshire or in, God forbid, Montana, Idaho, all these places? They don't, a lot of them actually, they don't want to hear it. So, they always felt that it's not a national thing, it's a regional thing, and they didn't take it too seriously. So, but I never got any promotion. So at that point, I was fed up and I said, forget it. And I went back to school. First, I went to LA City College, took a Chicano studies class, loved it, went full time to Cal State Los Angeles, got my degree in 78, I believe, in Chicano studies. And in studying those subjects, my music became even more Chicano. And I started writing all kinds of stuff then. about Chicano culture and Chicano history and with Latin rhythms. And I came up with my own brand of Chicano rock, which is different from El Chicano and Tierra and Malo and all those people that you were saying, you know. So I have both types of music. I have a whole catalog of what I call my Chicano rock, Chicano music, and I have a whole category of just rock and roll, you know, and country rock.
Yeah. Can you speak to that love for rock and roll that is so, that is just kind of so strong in the Chicano community, and that love that kind of that drove you there? Initially, you did mention your love for the Beatles and Bob Dylan, et cetera, which I think kind of speaks to the fact that that Chicanos, we're not a monolith, right? You can be Chicano and be so many things and love so many forms of music and play so many forms of music, which I think kind of speaks to your musical journey. So I wanted to see if you could speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, it goes way back because I remember being 5, 6 years old listening to Elvis Presley records. I loved Elvis. My brother, Dan, he's like 8, 9 years older than me. So when I was 5, he was 13 or whatever, and he had a record collection, and he had Elvis records and some of those 50s things. So I used to borrow his records and listen to him, and I just remember loving early Elvis, Jailhouse Rock and Heartbreak Hotel and I Want You, I Need You, I Love You, and I just loved Elvis. Then the next artist that I loved was the Everly Brothers. And I remember being 9 years old. I remember having a Everly Brothers Greatest Hits album that had Wake Up Little Susie and Bye Bye Love and all those great songs and loving it. And I used to write down the lyrics and sing the harmonies. And 9 years old, I was totally uh, loving that stuff. And of course, I love Little Richard. I had those early records. Oh my God. Keep a Knockin', Long Tall Sally, Jerry Lee Lewis, all that stuff. So I loved the 50s stuff and was very inspired already. And then came the doo-wop and a little more of the R&B before the British invasion. So I was already ignited with love for rock.
The other question, that I kind of wanted to ask you, were you at all kind of influenced? We talked about in white American blues musicians, African American rock and roll musicians that you loved, and then musicians from the UK. I'm curious, what about Richie Valens?
Well, of course, he was big because, again, we were all kids and we were, into whatever we were into. And when that came out, it was like, wow, a Chicano and he's singing La Bamba in Spanish and it's a pop hit. It was revolutionary and everybody was into Richie Valens. And I think that's part of what triggered people buying those guitars and sitting on the porch and learning and sharing. Richie Valens helped inspire a lot of Chicanos to buy guitars. So it definitely was an influence. But check this out. Here's a story that my dad tells in his autobiography, Lalo Guerrero, My Life and Music. And I remember it happening. So the trip we took to Tijuana, where we bought my guitar. Now we didn't go just to get my guitar. We went there anyway as a little family trip, but it was going to be the trip where I got my guitar. So we went down there, we bought the guitar. On the way back, his car broke down and we had to go to this garage and it took about 4 or 5 hours for them to fix it. So while they were fixing the car, I was noodling around on the guitar. And my dad says that by the time we were driving home on the freeway, I was playing and singing La Bamba. And I remember.
Yeah.
So that's a pretty funny thing. But again, it was the Richie Valens song.
Yeah, and it sounds like it left an indelible mark on you and probably on so many young kids all across the country, and then but in particular in Southern California where Richie lived and played, right?
Right. Now I must add to that, yes, Richie had that song in Spanish that went national and a rock and roll hit. But we have to remember my dad was doing it long before, but in the Chicano market, in the Latino market. So, my dad was doing blues in Spanish in the late 40s, early 50s. He was doing boogie woogie. He was doing rock and roll, Tin Marín de Dopingüe, probably 55. So my dad was rocking and rocking in Spanish before anybody, but only the Chicano community knew about it, and just a certain segment of it and a certain generation. But, Richie brought it mainstream for my generation. But we have to remember that my dad was doing it amazingly and way early.
Yeah, no, without a doubt. Yeah, without a doubt. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Just kind of this, this hybrid sound that that was unique and hip and urban and modern and yeah, yeah,
And all the slang, the calo.
yeah, yeah. Can we um speak a little bit about your work with your dad?
Oh, wow.
You did play and record with your father, kind of like after you had kind of like done your own like individual work. And I'm wondering how did that prepare you, help you to work with your dad, kind of having some of the experiences that you'd had in the music industry?
Another great question. It actually goes back before what you said. I go back to the beginning in terms of I was working with my dad from the early 60s. And but here's what happened. And here's how he helped us. Um, Before we made our record in 65, when we were 13, when 63, he took me and Ernie and Richard into the studio where he was recording, where he would record. It was called Jimmy Jones Studio in Pasadena. That's where he made all his records in the, 60s, 70s. And he took us in there and just let us record a couple of songs, and he paid for it. And we walked out of there with a little acetate. So that was exciting. It wasn't a record, it wasn't released, but we had a little acetate recording of us in the studio. And we did a Venture song. I played lead on, and then the flip side, Robert Warren played lead on a blues. We called it the blues. That was it. But it gave us the experience. We were in a recording studio at 13, And then a year later, he took us in again. By that time, Rick Rosas was in the band, and we did another acetate. So we had a little bit of recording experience when we had the opportunity with Billy Cardenas. At that point, we went in with our 7-piece band, and we already had a couple of years of playing experience. But that was a nice thing that he did. Plus, he took us on one tour, he took us on this little tour that went up to, I think it was San Jose and Merced, I don't know, it was in Bakersfield. And so we were 3 little kids. We were in the station wagon with all these grizzled old musicians, veterans drinking and getting high. And we opened for my dad on that. So those were the 2 little things that he did for us. I wouldn't say they were little, but they were things that inspired us. And Rick Rosas later talked about that, who later wound up playing for years with Neil Young and Joe Walsh. He said, that early tour and all those things we did, gave him the bug, and we all did many recordings through the 60s and 70s. So by the time he had his opportunity to play with Joe Walsh, he had all that experience that we had given him, all the recording experience we had and all the live that we had all those years, 10 years or more. But over the years in the 60s, my dad would bring my band in to back him up on rock and roll songs. So I remember the first one we did, official record with my dad, was one of his squirrel songs, the Ardillitas, the little squirrels like Alvin and the Chipmunks. It was a record about them. And we played, we were the band that backed him up. It was a rock and roll song. So after that, he'd bring us in. Mark and the Escorts did a lot of records with him. And they came out really good. There was one called Los Greñudos, about the hippies. And it was great, And so we made a bunch of records with him throughout the 60s. And And I recorded with him throughout the years in the 70s and even into the 80s. I used to go to Mexico City with him and we'd do Ardilla albums, you know. And I got to write some of the songs and be one of the squirrels at times, you know. And so I mean, I have a history of recording with my dad since 1964, probably. And then I've done a lot of shows with him, but the real shows with him didn't start. I don't know why we waited so long, but it wasn't until around 1999 when he was already, you know, late 70s, early 80s. We started doing shows together. And it started with Paris, France. We were there with Flaco Jimenez in 1998. It was a tremendous experience. And we played the Getty Center. We played Tucson. We played some of the casinos out here in the desert in Palm Springs. So I did a lot of shows with him, and I would always get to do a couple of my songs in all the shows. So I have a long history, and if you want to know more about it, go to my website, markguerrero.com, go to the Mark and Lalo page, and it'll lay it all out, you know, all the recordings we did and the live shows.
Yeah. Mark, you know, you've spent just significant time doing work around being able to document through interviews just anyone and everyone who has played in the East LA music scene, and I would say and beyond. And you've done a really great job at being able to capture those voices and those experiences. Can you speak a little bit about like what kind of sparked that work, and then like who are some of the folks that you've spoken to over the years?
Okay. Well, like everything else, it happened. I don't say accident, it just happened. And a lot of things were involved here. But basically what happened was there was a friend of mine said, "Hey man, there's this local music newspaper coming out here in Palm Springs, and they have a guy writing articles about blues. And you know, would you like to write an article?" And of course, I protested, "Oh man, I don't have time, and I don't know if I'm a writer, and I don't like deadlines." And you know, it could be a good thing. And I said, "Well, if I'm going to do it, it's going to be about Chicano artists, you know." And so he hooked me up with that newspaper, and that's what I started doing. I wrote an article on El Chicano, wrote an article on Tierra, wrote an article on Los Lobos, wrote an article on my dad, and it would come out on this local paper. And then, kind of by accident, some guy said, "Hey, I have this hosting company. You should have a website." And we hooked up my markguerrero.com. And my keyboard player, Tim Gross, who's now playing with Rick Springfield, a great keyboard player, he said, "Hey, you know, I know how to set up websites. You know, I'll set one up for you for like $100." So made a website. Then I thought, hey, why don't I just throw my articles on there that I wrote for the newspaper? So I did that, and that was the birth of my website, 1998. And I just kept that. Once that newspaper went out of business, I just kept doing the interviews and kept doing the articles for years. And then that eventually led to an opportunity to do an internet radio show through a CRN Live. Frank Miranda, he interviewed me when my dad passed away. And he said, "Hey, would you like a radio show?" And I said, "Yeah, I've been thinking about it for a few years, you know." And so I started the show Chicano Music Chronicles, and it was just audio. And I interviewed Trini Lopez, you know, Chan Romero, you know, Rudy and Steve Salas, you know, a lot of Chicano artists, you know, El Chicano. And then we stopped. And then years later, I just turned it into a podcast that's on 24/7. And I started doing more of those Chicano Music Chronicles shows. And I wound up doing 39 episodes. I got Chris Montez. I got Renee Ornelas. I've got Sonny Osuna, you know, Little Ray Jimenez, Little Willie G. So 39 episodes interviewing Chicano artists. and Latino artists. And then I kind of got burned out doing it. It took a lot of time because you do the interview, and as you know, hours and hours of editing, and I'm a real perfectionist about what I put out there. So, I kind of got burned, and I stopped for a while. And then another accident happened where Stephen Chavez of EastLAReview.com wanted me to interview a couple of people for him. And it wound up being on Zoom. And I did them, and I go, wow, this is cool. This is easy. I'm going to keep doing this. And I turned it into East LA Music Stories. And at this point, I've already got 36 episodes up in a little over 2 years. That's not bad. And
Yeah.
so you look at it, I got 39 Chicano Music Chronicles audio shows. I got 36 East LA Music Stories. The first show is about Chicano artists and Latino artists. This is about just East LA artists,
Gotcha.
So it could be any race. It could be it's just anybody who has their roots in some way in East LA and the East LA scene. So I'm having a ball with this because I get to interview everybody that I sort of played on the bill with and recorded with and whatever, and that I've known over the years. A few of them I didn't know too well, but I know now. But I'm having a real good time interviewing these people and chronicling the history of East LA rock, one artist at a time. And I'm going deeper on this because the other show was mostly the stars, the hit artists, the lead singers, the front people. This show is like the sax player from this band, the guitar player from this band, somebody that stood out, somebody who was a witness. And the bands that don't have to have had hit records or anything. If they were a good band, an interesting band, tell me your stories, So yeah. And
Yeah, no, that's
luckily,
great.
all my work, all these shows are at the University of California, Santa Barbara in their SEMA program. So every year I send them all I'm doing. So after we're all gone, they'll be up there preserved, and hopefully they'll be online, beyond us, so that these stories won't die out.
Yeah, no, great. And I know that on your site, I was trying to learn a little bit more. Just a couple of months ago, I found a couple of recordings on Imperial by Manny Lopez. And as I started doing a little research, most of the pages are attributed to you. And so
Right. Well, that's the
I came
thing.
back to your site and
That's
learned a little bit more about kind of what a powerhouse Manny Lopez
of
and
course.
his quintet and his orchestra kind of were.
That's what I'm saying. People like Manny Lopez, people like Don Tosti, guys from the 40s and 50s that were great Chicano artists. You can't find anything online about them except on my website. Same thing with a lot of the East LA bands. So if you put in those names, it's going to get to my website,
Yeah. Yeah, no,
markguerrero.com.
yeah, no, it was great. If you can give us the URL part of that website again,
It's
Mark?
just Mark, M-A-R-K, Guerrero, GUERRERO.com or .net. It'll take you there. It's got my history, my dad's history, a lot of the East LA and Chicano rock history. You can spend days, Somebody joked to me, hey, it's like the Library of Congress for the Chicano Library of Congress, But there's a lot of info. You can dive in there. All my podcasts, all my Zoom shows are on there. So go there and
Oh,
check it out.
yeah. What I also appreciated about that particular review or write-up on Manny Lopez were also some of the historic photos that you posted, including Manny Lopez at the Palladium. Uh,
Being in
um,
the Elvis movie, funny
yeah,
how people
I
go.
think that was really fantastic. Those are some things that I didn't know, right? So I think,
And I have interviews, live interviews with Don Tosti and Manny Lopez on my website as well, on the podcasts.
did you ever do anything with Chico Sesma?
Chico Sesma, no, I never met him. And I did reach out to him a few years ago. I got his phone number. I called him. His wife answered. He was ill at the time.
Yeah.
And I told her, please let him know I'd love to interview him, for historical purposes. And, I said, I'm Lalo Guerrero's son because I knew he knew who my dad was. And he didn't want to do it. He passed.
Hmm.
So I don't know if he was too ill, but
Yeah.
I couldn't get him to do it.
Because I know that his orchestra backed your dad on a couple of sides
Yeah, yeah.
that are really. I think they might be on the Real label, and I think there's the tracks are just phenomenal.
A lot of people don't know that he was an orchestra guy or
He was an
musician. They
orchestra
think
guy.
of him as a radio personality.
That's right. Yeah. So both. Yeah. Yep, so both. Yeah. And a great trombonist, from what I understand too.
And same with me. I don't want people to forget I'm a musician with all this historical stuff. That's just half of what I'm doing, you know.
That's right. That's right. I was gonna say I want to do a time check, and I know that I've got to go in a couple of minutes, so
Okay.
we can stop here. All right.
I think that should do, huh?
Okay. So I'm
Okay,
gonna
man.
just stop.
Thank you.